everyone. Welcome to the Climate Policy Initiative webinar on the Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2023, which was published last Thursday and is available on the CPI website. This webinar will be presented by a CPI analysis team, Bison Aran, Costanza Strinazzi, Jake Connolly, Sean Stouts, and Valerio Macale, following an introduction from Dr. Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director at CPI. The format will be a presentation followed by a question and answer session. You're welcome to submit a question at any point via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CPI website in the coming days. And now I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Great, well, thank you so much for joining us today, as I'm very excited to launch the 2023 edition of our Global Landscape of Climate Finance report, the first flagship report we ever worked on and published in CPI's early days, which is now over a decade ago. With just weeks to go until COP28, the 2023 Global Landscape of Climate Finance report is being released at a critical time. And we have good news and bad news for you, as you will soon hear. We hit the first trillion milestone in climate finance. However, our estimated needs are 5 times higher. In the meantime, 2023 has been a year where the world broke all-time heat records. Climate change is not in the future anymore. It is here. It is now. Our findings indicate the urgent need to work towards mobilizing finance in regions where capital is lacking, as well as sectors where the progress is lacking to meet our climate targets. At Climate Policy Initiative, we hope that by providing decision makers with robust and comprehensive information on progress against real climate investment needs, we will help them prioritize action and enact ambitious policies. If you're not familiar with CPI, we are an analysis and advisory organization with deep expertise in finance and policies. We work with governments, with financial institutions and businesses to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we have 6 offices around the world: in Brazil, in India, in Indonesia, the US, the UK, and a growing presence in Africa. So the landscape has the most comprehensive information available about the scale, key actors, instruments, recipients, and users of finance supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation in 2021 and 2022. We started this work back in 2010, and now we have over a decade of experience in tracking climate finance. Previous editions of the report have served as the basis for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, chapters on climate finance, and the UNFCCC's biannual assessments, an overview of climate finance flows, and as a background for G7 and G20 statements. Let me also acknowledge that this report was made possible by the support from the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety through the International Climate Initiative, ICI, and we really thank you for that, and to the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. So this year we have made several innovations, as we try to do every year, but these new innovations include new data on climate finance flows that particularly lack data such as energy efficiency, FLU, and water, but also bolstering investment need estimates and new analysis on cost of inaction, as well as further breakdown of finance into emerging markets and developing economies, as well as least developed countries. And so quickly on the agenda, we'll start first looking at the scope of finance flows. Then we'll go into various breakdowns of the total landscape of climate finance globally, including instruments, public and private actors, users and sectors, and geographical splits. And please note that we will provide investment totals in US dollar terms in annual averages for 2021 and 2022. We'll then follow with a brief introduction and preliminary view of our Net Zero Finance Tracker, which is another key interactive tool or platform with which we try to increase in transparency and help measure progress of where public and private finance institutions stand compared to our net zero goals. And then we'll end with some time for Q&A. So let me now hand it over to the ones who have all done all the work, and most importantly, my colleague Baisa, who will take you through the scope of our work, discussions around key findings, and private and public actors. So Baisa, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Well, shall we dive into our key findings straight away? So average annual climate finance flows reached almost $1.3 trillion. So most recently, so this means it nearly doubled compared to 4 years ago. And of course, as Barbara mentioned, this is a very noteworthy milestone. But something to really highlight here is that this large uptick was primarily driven by significant acceleration in finance itself, mitigation finance, which increased by almost $440 billion annual average compared to 2019 and 2020. And then, as you can see in this graph, there is 173 billion in finance flows is due to improved data on climate finance, which we think is also good news. So just a quick clarification on what we track and what we don't track. So our analysis covers primary annual flows into climate mitigation and climate adaptation interventions. So we track both international, domestic, public, and private. So literally everything that's going on globally. And we really focus on the real economy change and on the ground climate investment at the project level. So things like building renewable power plants or building adaptive capacity of a local community and things like that. So what this really means is that we don't track, for example, transfer funds in the financial market. A good example is issuance of green bonds that are not yet allocated to use of proceeds or projects. And another thing to note here is that we really take due care in our methodology so that we present with you a non-double counted number every year. So moving on, of course, increase of finance is great news, but really if we take a step back and think about what it actually requires us to go to low carbon and climate resilient development, and as this graph here shows, a reality check shows that we need at least $5.9 trillion in annual investment by 2030. So these range of estimates are based on publicly available data and scenarios across sectors such as energy, agriculture, industry, adaptation as well. So to clarify, the climate finance needs is not an exact science. It will really depend on the decisions we take today or the growth decarbonization trajectories different countries will choose in the near future. And then depending on sector or region, of course, the needs are not the same in every country. Now, let's put the $1 trillion required into perspective. Yeah, of course, these 5-10 trillion sound like a lot of money, but what actually these $1 trillion mean and how it compares to other things we spend on. So 1.3 trillion in climate investment from last 2 years, annual investments, is only about 1% of global GDP. And then in 2022, public sector alone spent twice the size of climate finance to military. The other thing is we spend over $1 trillion in direct subsidies to fossil fuel and also end up spending additional 5 to 6 trillion in implicit fossil fuel subsidies. And then it all leads us to a question, really, how do we get the trillions in climate investment so we achieve the net zero target as well as Paris goals? On the other hand, delaying climate action and failing to keep the world on a 1.5-degree trajectory will result in a significantly higher cost down the line. So climate change impacts such as increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, and more frequent extreme weather events will result in labor losses, reduced agricultural yields, as well as damages to assets, capital, and productive land. So it really affects all aspects of our lives. And of course, the cost of inaction will rise the longer we delay. This year, we compiled available studies and literature on this subject to really see how this delay and cost of inaction looks like. So as you can see in this graph, investing now really makes sense. It will result in a considerable reduction in social and economic losses for our future generation. So 1,266 trillion lower compared to a business as usual scenario. So the other thing to point is that this numbers that we compiled on this graph is probably a dramatic underestimate because there are many things that it's very hard to estimate in terms of costs. So things like biodiversity loss, stranded assets, or broader social issues like migration and conflict. So we wouldn't really be able to count how much those would be. So in the next slide, we see our famous Sankey diagram. And it really shows a very good picture in terms of what we track, what we try to do with our work. So it provides a snapshot of climate finance flows through the life cycle. And then on the left-hand side, you can see capital sources and intermediaries categorized into public and private sources. And then they are further broken down into individual actors like commercial financial institutions, corporations, government actors, etc. Then you can see the instruments breakdown, and every financial flow is broken down to mitigation, adaptation, and dual benefits. And then finally, we break it down into economic sectors. But beyond that, we also look into the destination of regions of destination and also origins of countries. So our database is quite comprehensive in that sense. And one innovation this year we had is if you go on our website, you can click on the Sankey diagram and really see the different details, different breakdown of all the flows to sectors and instruments and things like that. Now let's look into the public and private finance sources of finance in more details, which is a very important aspect when it comes to climate finance discussions. So overall share of tracked climate finance provided by public sources are slightly more than half of the total. But then mobilizing private finance at scale is really, really important in the years ahead, given the limited public budget we have. So we really need to get private finance going to climate mitigation adaptation activities and really hitting the road. So in terms of key financiers of climate finance, national development finance institutions and development finance institutions overall continue to provide a majority of public finance. So followed by state-owned entities and government expenditure. Whereas from the private finance, we see that they provided $625 billion per year. And they're led by commercial financial institutions, corporations, households, because these are the main actors that directly engage with real economic activities. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Costanza, who will discuss the findings for mitigation finance. Over to you, Costanza.
Thank you very much, Faisal. Let's now delve into climate mitigation finance. As we can see from the graph here, mitigation continues to attract almost all climate finance, receiving in fact more than 90% of the total, and leaving adaptation dual benefits projects far behind. Mitigation projects in the energy and transport sector alone were responsible for 2/3 of total climate finance flows in 2021 and 2022. Mitigation also seems to attract virtually all climate finance coming from the private sector here in orange, while adaptation and to a lesser extent dual benefit projects remain a prerogative of the public sector. Specifically in 2021 and 2022, annual adaptation finance, annual mitigation finance, reached 1.2 trillion, growing 60% compared to the previous biennium. This is an all-time high growth for mitigation finance, one that really does drive the major increase that we see in total climate finance flows. The increase was largely driven by higher investments in renewable energy and electric vehicles in East Asia, Europe, and Latin America. In fact, growth has not been consistent across mitigation sectors. The energy and transport sector continue to attract the majority of mitigation flows, with energy receiving 44% of the total, as you can see here on the left side. Within the energy sector, renewable energy attracted 97% of finance, with solar PV and onshore wind dominating. These two markets have undergone exponential growth in recent years, particularly thanks to continued declines in technology costs and strong policy support across several countries in the world. Sadly, despite the need for a swift transition of the global energy system, annual investments in new renewable energy assets remain only half the investments made in new fossil fuel assets. So much more needs to be done in the sector to really shift policy support and capital away from fossil fuels and towards renewables and other energy transition technologies. Second, to the energy sector, transport received 29% of annual mitigation finance and reached an all-time high level in 2021 and 2022. This was due to exponential growth in EV sales in China, Western Europe, and the US. A positive trend we have observed in recent years is that many EV markets have matured and are becoming more and more competitive with fossil fuel alternatives, especially for cars. Other mitigation sectors beyond energy and transport received comparatively low finance. In particular, agriculture and industry, which are major sources of emissions, received disproportionately smaller share of mitigation finance, accounting for less than 4% of the total. Now, although mitigation attracts the majority of climate finance, the investment gap to avoid the worst impacts of climate change remains huge. This chart compares mitigation finance flows in green with mitigation finance needs in yellow and mitigation potential on the secondary axis. What we see is that while mitigation finance reached 1.2 trillion, annual flows actually need to reach 8.4 trillion per year between now and 2030. This is a 7-time increase compared to current levels, and flow further needs to grow in the following 2 decades to reach 10.4 trillion per year, which is more than 8.5 times higher than the current investments. If we look at the sector breakdown, the largest investment gaps in absolute terms are observed in the transport and energy sector. However, in relative terms, the most significant gaps are seen in the AFOLU and industry sectors, where funding really needs to increase by more than 180 and 136 times compared to current levels. Underfunding in the AFOLU sector is especially concerning, given that the sector is estimated to have the largest mitigation potential and yet still receives minimal finance when it comes to mitigation. Solutions such as sustainable crops, livestock production, afforestation and reforestation, just to name a few, really have a crucial role to play in putting the world on a 1.5-degree trajectory. When looking at financial instruments used, we see that mitigation flows were dispersed through a broader range of financial instruments compared to adaptation and dual benefit flows. This is due to a wider variety of investors involved, both from the private and public sector, all with different mandates and risk-return profiles. As we can see from the graph, about 60% of mitigation finance was raised through debt. This was mainly in the form of project-level debt in purple, although some debt was also issued through balance sheets of companies in red to the right. Equity financing, mainly balance sheet equity, accounted for 35% of the total and was provided for the most part by private investors, particularly for renewable energy efficient buildings, and sustainable transport solutions. Concessional finance, which includes low-cost debt in light purple and grants in blue, accounted for less than 10% of total mitigation finance. Not surprisingly, this share is much lower for mitigation than it is for adaptation and dual benefits, where returns are generally not as high as in mitigation, and the landscape is made up, as we saw it before, primarily of public investors. Something to keep in mind is that, especially in these sectors, concessional finance really plays a key role in unlocking further capital, and it is really crucial to managing risks and uncertainties, especially related to emerging technologies and markets. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Sean to go over the adaptation finance section of the landscape.
Thanks, Costanza. So yeah, now we turn to adaptation finance, which reached $63 billion in 2021-22, a record high. However, a more modest growth rate was observed compared with the last landscape, and adaptation accounts for only 5% of the global total overall. As you can see in the Sankey here, adaptation finance was largely channeled as debt, with an emphasis on project-level market rate debt, and was heavily distributed between the water and wastewater sector, which is intuitive given increasing water stress globally, and so-called other cross-sectoral solutions, which includes investments in early warning systems and policy and capacity building. As my colleagues have said, Tracked adaptation finance remains dominated by public actors who contributed 98% of the total, with DFIs therein providing most of the funding. And this really reflects a genuine drive by these public institutions to avoid or minimize the adverse impact of climate change, but also the issues we face with monitoring adaptation finance in and from the private sector. Ultimately, however, it is clear that the global adaptation funding gap is widening. As you can see on this slide here, CPI estimates that developing countries alone need $212 billion per year in adaptation finance up to 2030, and then $239 billion annually between 2031 and 2050. So what that means is adaptation finance needs are approximately 3.5 times higher than the tracked global total for developing countries alone. It is important when we're looking at global adaptation finance to differentiate between what funding is sourced and committed domestically within countries and what is sourced and committed internationally. We see that overall, adaptation finance exhibits a more even split between domestic and international flows compared to mitigation finance. However, looking at the regional breakdowns as shown in this figure here indicates the variability therein. Most domestic adaptation finance is for countries in East Asia and Pacific with an emphasis on China. However, if you filter the internet by international funding only, Sub-Saharan Africa is the largest recipient, receiving almost 1/3 of the international total. And this is what we would expect given the vulnerability of the region. However, comparing these figures with African countries' adaptation needs as recorded in their NDCs reveals a substantial regional funding gap with a need to scale international support at least 5-fold by 2030. So returning to the global picture of all tracked climate finance, we now consider the geographic distribution of flows. As you can see in this map here, East Asia and Pacific continues to dominate at $558 billion, followed by Western Europe and US and Canada. And together, these three regions account for 84% of total global climate finance. You can also see here the public-private splits per region, which can vary quite substantially. For example, the relative dominance of private capital in US and Canada and Oceania compared to the importance of public funding in Sub-Saharan Africa. This year, we categorize countries according to economic development status, differentiating between developed economies, emerging market developing economies, EMDEs, and least developed countries, LDCs. And here we find that just over 2% of global climate finance flowed to or within LDCs, while 14% flowed to or within EMDEs, excluding China. We are therefore, in many cases, seeing an imbalance between climate change vulnerability and the destination of climate finance, with some of the most vulnerable countries who are disproportionately at risk from climate change receiving only very little, if not minimal, finance. And this year, we also undertook an additional analysis of South-South flows, which we define as international finance committed to and by G77 countries, including China, for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. This includes these countries' weighted contributions to multilateral financial institutions, for example, money they commit to the World Bank and which is then spent in another G77 country. It's worth noting that this South-South analysis is based on the climate finance data we have access to, which does include several DFIs in the Global South who are members of the International Development Finance Club. However, we are still limited in terms of data coverage for this topic and urge relevant actors to start reporting on this. Nonetheless, we found that $18 billion, or under 2% of global climate finance, was channeled as South-South flows, as shown on this Sankey here, the majority of which was committed by countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to other countries in the LATAC region, followed by East Asia and Pacific. While South-South flows cannot be considered a substitute for North-South climate finance, there is growing recognition of the potential for South-South collaboration to tackle the climate crisis, given that these countries often share similar financial, capacity building, and technological needs or constraints, and can therefore learn from each other in terms of locally feasible climate solutions and best practices. So I'll now turn it back over to Baisa, who will walk you through the recommendations that we derived from the study.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sean. So let's move to the key recommendations we have from Global Landscape this year. So of course, climate finance really needs to step change. We need leapfrogging in climate investment from both public and private sectors. So the four priorities that we set out here is really a big picture thinking in terms of what should be our collective thinking and how we can think bigger and really make sure that we make a step change in climate finance. So firstly, transforming the financial system, so across both public and private finance. So this includes things like reforming international financial institutions, which is gaining significant traction. So international financial institutions are uniquely positioned to take more risks, channel innovative finance, and leverage concessional finance to expand private flows. And then from the private sector side, we really need to see all these net zero commitments to translate into meaningful changes on the ground. But this is a missing link in terms of how this is really happening. And then the second thing is bridging climate and development needs. So here we're talking about things like harnessing synergies between development and climate action, so that, for example, there could be co-benefits to nature, public health, energy access, food systems, gender equality, and so on. Mainstreaming adaptation and resilience is going to be really, really important. So it's necessary that adaptation activities across all financial systems and major infrastructure is integrated and mainstreamed. And then thirdly, phasing out fossil fuel through a just transition is a priority still, because investing in clean alone will not be sufficient. Now, the third area is about mobilizing domestic capital. So this includes things like aligning NDCs with 1.5-degree compatible scenarios, in addition to clear and ambitious policy frameworks. And then the other thing in the domestic side, it's very important to create a local ecosystem for climate investment, so that domestic capital actors can have the capacity and know how to issue green bonds, attract capital from international markets, and so on. Now, the fourth area, we say this again and again every year, it's about acting to improve data. So high quality climate finance data is super important to understand investment gap and building effective solutions. And then, of course, inform the investors on where to prioritize next. We are advancing data every year, but pervasive data gaps across sectors still exist. And something that I would like to say, that putting together all this data that we presented to you is not an easy task. All data is scattered across different data sources. They're not standardized. And the thing is, frankly, nobody has an obligation to report on climate finance, including domestic public budgets and private finance. So it's a very heterogeneous data set that we work with. But on this note, I just wanted to mention that on improving data, of course, there are lots of organizations who are working in the space. And then on this cause, we have another presentation on net zero finance tracker to really understand how financial system net zero commitments is contributing to climate goals. So we have some preliminary findings and demo to share with you. This will be shared by my colleagues Valerio and Jake. And the tracker is an important complement to the landscape because it looks at upstream activities by financial institutions that lead to the required climate finance flows and impact in the real economy. So over to you, Valerio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baisa, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. The Net Zero Finance Tracker is a collaborative data platform providing a comprehensive assessment of how private finance institutions are progressing on the Paris agreements and net zero goals. We track a three-dimensional thing. We should show the slides at this moment, just so that you know. This comes later. We track three dimensions that reflect how organizations are responding, from intention set through targets, through integration in day-to-day operations, and impact on the ground. Each dimension is assessed by a set of underlying indicators, for example, disclosure of climate risk under implementation and the exposure to misaligned assets under impact. We measure indicators by capturing, standardizing, and assessing actions across multiple existing data sources, including CDP, PRI, influence map, and many others. The tracker will continually evolve as aligned action becomes better defined and data availability improves. In the next slide, we'd like to share some preliminary outcomes from the work. Just let me flag before it that our analysis covers data available from more than 500 members of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero GFANs. Because of this, it reflects action among financial institutions that are already committing to align with net zero. And as a result, progress is not representative of the financial system transition as a whole. Our ambition is to, over the time, gradually expand coverage of financial institutions to provide a more complete picture. So what have we observed? Starting from targets, so in this slide, we observe that most GFANs institutions are just starting to adopt broad net zero mitigation targets. Targets related to investment in climate solutions and divestment for fossil fuels are instead far less common. Adoption of targets has been driven mainly by investor demand for transparency on the climate risks associated with their investment, and the growth of voluntary membership initiatives, which have specific guidelines and provide support to institutions to engage more proactively in net zero transition goals and in implementation. We observe that relatively more robust targets usually lead to relatively more robust implementation measures. Here, most progress of GFANs entities has been observed in the adoption of climate risk strategies and in climate risk management, as well as disclosure of emissions data. On the risk side, main drivers have been, again, increasing awareness of climate risk and its ability to lead to systemic financial crisis, regulatory bodies applying increasing pressure on financial institutions to manage climate risk, and the contribution of the task force of climate-related financial disclosure, now mandatory in some countries. On the impact side, instead, next slide, one of the progress indicators we have looked into is project-level finance indicators. Here we see that although observed clean energy investment highlighted in green from GFANs entities is now higher than fossil fuel investment highlighted in red, clean to fossil fuel investment ratio, as shown by the black line in the graph, falls short of what is needed to achieve Paris Agreement goals. According to BNF, the ratio needs to double its current rate to hit 4:1 by 2030 and 10:1 for the 2041-2050 decade to avoid the worst effect on climate change. There are several reasons why progress on targets and implementation still appear to be disconnected from result. Main reason is that it takes time for new policies to influence investment. There is a natural time lag between improving investment allocation procedures, decision-making resulting from them, and investment on the ground. Secondly, there needs to be better targets and better reporting on related progress and impacts. For example, climate-related investment targets have not yet been adopted at scale, and as a result, fail to provide incentives to shift investment practices. Similarly, disclosure of clean investment is not yet fully in place. There's also a data problem, which was already mentioned by Baisa. The coordination between data providers is critical to ensure that data efforts focus on closing information gaps. For example, we need the metrics that can improve accountability of the financial system's impact in the real economy by looking at how financial actors are not only directly but also indirectly contributing to the deployment of capital towards renewable energy and fossil fuel projects as shareholders or corporate lenders. We also need to make data more accessible and standardized and machine readable from the source. This is something that the Net Zero Data Public Utility, for example, is trying to address. Finally, stronger action by government is still required to discourage misaligned investment, which may persist due to pressure to deliver short-term financial results over long-term sustainability consideration. And now over to my colleague Jake, who will walk you through the functionalities of the dashboard.
Thank you, Valerio. So we will now give an overview of the features of the web dashboard, starting with the aggregate page, which should in just a second. And this page allows users to visualize the year-to-year changes in the performance of the entirety of the universe of entities tracked in our data, as well as any kind of geographical or sectoral subsets of it. The default visualization you can see on the screen covers the whole set of financial institutions that are members of GFANZ as of December 2022, and shows the evolution of scores in the target dimensions based on the number of institutions that have been assigned a given score, from no action in grey all the way to partial action, partial response in the darkest shade of green on the graph. Note that no institution has scored a full response categorization, which is the darkest shade of green in the graph, as this requires in turn to be scored in full response in each individual indicator that makes up the target dimension. So for the target dimension, this is adoption of mitigation targets, adoption of a climate finance target, and the adoption of a divestment target. No tracked institution currently satisfies these conditions. However, when you navigate to the individual institution page, you'll see a full response for entities that do have a full response in those indicators. The visualization can then be tweaked to slice the data in whichever way the end user would like. At the top right, you can see you can choose the country on which to focus, as well as the sector and the subsector of interest within the universe of financial institutions. Lastly, the distribution of scores can be visualized in a multitude of ways by clicking the change. If we click on the change in the top left-hand corner there, one can select the type of aggregation, such as the AUM, total assets, revenue, AUM, or total assets, a combination of the two. By doing so, the distribution of scores will be weighted by the relative size of the institutions being scored in a given shade of green in the overall universe of entities tracked. In order to highlight the incompleteness of the underlying financial data that we have, we also display the degree of coverage for the aggregator chosen in 2022, which is obviously 100% for the number of institutions, and then whatever the number is for the different aggregators chosen. So the aggregation visualization, which is useful to appreciate the overall state of the net zero transition at a large scale, is based on individual entity level data that can be accessed clicking the institution data on the top right link in the page there. So this will redirect you to the table that you can see now, containing the names of all the financial institutions tracked and each of the scores and impact metrics that have been attributed to them according to our methodology. Note that once again, you can filter on country, sector, subsector, just like in the aggregate data section. And additionally, one can also order institutions based on descending or ascending score of each of the indicators tracked, as well as the overall dimensions impact metrics, such as portfolio emissions, investment in green projects, green lending, etc. Lastly, by clicking anywhere on the row relating to a given institution, this will redirect you to the individual level page, individual entity page, where a further level of detail is given on the scores and the metrics attributed to that entity. So entity level data is organized as follows. There are three main sections following the dimensions in the previous graph. So targets, implementation, which are qualitative, and impact, which is quantitative. The first two sections allow you to visualize the score that has been attributed to each financial institution by clicking the plus on the right-hand side there, sign next to the score, to learn about the actions that have been tracked for that entity and used to determine the score that is visualized. So the drivers displayed here are the equivalent of what you will find in the methodological acts of the Net Zero Finance Tracker in what we call the pseudocode. So it's a set of hierarchical rules that have been developed internally that are used to determine the final score for each entity that is assigned for all the indicators tracked and displayed here. And the last section, impact, which you can see here, on the other hand, is more quantitative data in the form of bar charts and gives information on the following metrics. So we have green project level financing, green lending, high emissions project level financing, exposure to misaligned assets, exposure to fossil fuel, and portfolio emissions. And when the data point is tracked for that particular metric, we display the data for the past 5 years. Conversely, for misaligned portfolio exposures, the data is shown as a percentage, if we scroll down there, of the overall portfolio value in the last available year, which is currently 2022. Okay, back to my colleague, Valeria.
Yes, thanks so much, Jake. This again, let me state again that this is preliminary results from the dashboard. The dashboard is currently in undergoing review, and we would really welcome any comment from anyone interested in looking a little bit more in depth into the dashboard as it is now. So please feel free to reach out bilaterally, and we're happy to share the link with you. Now over to Baisa to close.
Great. Thank you very much. We received some excellent questions in the Q&A, and feel free to add any further questions. We've got 20 more minutes to answer any questions you might have. So we answered already 2 questions live. So maybe we can start with a question about the needs number. So there's a question about what are the scenarios used to compute the 2030 investments needed. And I'd like to invite my colleague Costanza to shed a bit of light on that. And then we can go to the other questions. Costanza, over to you.
Thank you, Baisa, and thanks so much for the question. So for our estimates of climate finance needs, we use several different scenarios covering different sectors. We try to be as comprehensive as possible and capture key needs estimates developed by different institutions. This is, of course, an exercise that we aim to improve every year. This year, we have included, we have reviewed actually 30 to 40 scenarios and analysis done by different institutions and across sectors. And we have selected in the end 15 scenarios for different sectors, including, for example, those developed by the IEA, BNEF, IRENA, the IPCC, UNEP, just really to mention a few. There is a comprehensive list of sources and scenarios that we have reviewed and used this year to come up with these figures, both for 2030 and 2050. I'll share the link in the chat to the document. The methodology also includes some further details on how we have combined and standardized data coming from different scenarios. I'll share the link in the chat right now.
Great. Thanks a lot, Costanza. So next, I thought to group 2 questions that are in the Q&A box. So one is around how and what the data sources we use to size climate finance from funds and institutional investors. So there's a bit of a methodological discussion that needs to go in there. So we'll clarify that in a bit. And I think it also links really well with the other question around how much have you analyzed companies' financial statements and other filings with financial regulators. So it's a very connected issue. So I'll start and I'll ask my colleague Valeria to also complement here as well. So just on the first question about funds and institutional investors is that with the global landscape, our scope of analysis, understanding what's happening on the ground in the real economy. So this means we really need to understand things that's happening at the project level. So we want to understand what sort of solar panels are being installed, what investments and activities that are helping with the local communities to improve mitigation adaptation solutions for smallholder farms. So we're really talking about very specific project level activities. But when it comes to that, institutional investors do not directly invest in those, but they rather invest in the financial market. They invest into companies that then later engage in those real economy activities, which is why they are shown in a small amount in our assessment. But the thing is, because financial system is so complicated, it's very layered. Institutional investors and funds might well be investing into those corporations who are then investing in the real economy. So that's the clarification that we'd like to make. But then we also have another sort of project in the making to really understand the link between what these funds and financial markets are sort of resulting in the impact on the real economy, which is why we're doing this net zero finance tracker to really understand and establish those links. And then the other question around the financial statements, whether we looked into that. Yes, the answer is yes, we looked into it in the past. But then the thing is, climate investment and climate sort of reporting is such in an early stage right now, even if there's so much happening. Majority of the reporting is still on a voluntary basis. So nobody is really forced and required to report. And not even talking about climate investments. It's really around the TCFD, and very detailed information about climate finance or climate investment is lacking from the companies. And we've done a detailed study on that, really looking into net zero commitments and targets, and also investments reporting by private financial institutions 2 years ago, and we can link that. So maybe Valerio, I think you will have more to say on this topic. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Baz. I think you covered a lot of very interesting points already. So you, Baz, already mentioned the work we're starting. So the moment, as Baz mentioned, a lot of these actors sit really in the middle of the financial system, so far away from being at the forefront of deployment of capital into new projects, whether they are fossil fuel projects or renewable energy projects. At the moment, we are able to track through the landscape and also in the net zero finance target dashboard, mainly project level investment. We are also starting to capture some corporate level investment, which is type of activity that can be tracked at the level of financial entities. But the data there is again quite patchy, not fully comparable between what goes into green solutions vis-a-vis what goes into high emission financing, fossil fuel financing. So one thing we're starting to do this year is really trying to expand the data on the impact side and looking and try to link the investment that happens on the ground. So these new projects into fossil fuel plants or renewable energy plant with the rest of the financial system by looking into equity ownership and debt ownership. And hopefully this will shed light and increase the transparency over the responsibility, the role, let's say, of the financial system in enabling this investment. Regarding the second element of the question, the reportings that we track at a company level, yeah, that's something that we capture. And as part of the net zero finance tracker, we have indeed looked into company reporting as available, however, via available secondary data sets, which represent the core of around which the net zero finance tracker is built. And what we observed is that various implementation actions tend to happen on climate risk strategy, climate risk management, and disclosure. The actions that are most likely to happen in terms of implementation. However, this is to say that it's currently only focused on GFANZ entities that are currently incorporated in the dashboard. But we again, as stated before, plan to expand over time the coverage of these financial entities.
Great. Thanks a lot, Valerio. So there are two questions related to methodology. So one is around when you mention government funds directed to mitigation projects, what is the source where you get the data from? So that's one. And the second one is, do you consider investment in research and development as part of climate finance? So like startups innovating in different sectors and things like that. So these are interesting methodological questions, so I can take those. So for the government funds, we get the data from various sources. So one is directly from government websites and the government budgetary sources. And it's really dependent on those governments making that data publicly available. If it's not made publicly available, but maybe they do those projects, we won't be able to capture that. But if it's available, then we'll be able to capture that. The other thing is, of course, investment from global north to global south. There's a publicly available data source on the OECD. So we can get that data from there too. So these are the main data sources that we use. And then the second question is quite interesting around research and development, right? So it's there's a dilemma for us as researchers and the methodological choices we make. So on one count, R&D investment could, in theory, constitute a double counting once that investment realizes into a real tangible sort of capital, right? So I guess in renewable energy, we don't necessarily tend to capture it because, once it's done, in accounting, maybe if you're familiar, R&D sort of tends to accumulate in balance sheet, and then it's later capitalized once it realizes. So in that sense, once it realizes, there's a risk of double counting, which is why we normally tend to not count R&D as part of our global landscape exercise. But then we are increasingly seeing that it's really important to track that, especially in nascent sectors where innovation is still required. So in those areas, we try to see how much investment is going into R&D. So it's really a choice in terms of which sector, whether the sector is nascent or very mature. So moving on to other questions, there are two questions, and I'd like to invite my colleagues, Sean, to answer that. So one is on the South-South flows, where, about the provider countries, where were the major providers in each region? And then the other one is, you've already answered that in the chat, but also there's another question around adaptation finance. Are you able to disaggregate social sectors in the adaptation financing from development financing institutions? This has been a challenge because, yeah, Sean, you probably relate to these two questions quite a lot. So over to you, Sean.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the questions. So in terms of our South-South data, a substantial amount of the climate finance commitments we track there come from various members of the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, many of whom are based and operate in the Global South. So some key providers there are CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, GABAI, Central American Bank for Economic Integration, DBSA, Development Bank of Southern Africa. And then this South-South analysis also took the weighted contributions of G77 countries' contributions to multilateral financial institutions like World Bank, and then the key players there would be like AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. So that's how we went about that South-South flows analysis. And yeah, as I said, we do LAT data there as well. So there's some big countries, China, for example, that their international commitments we couldn't fully track there. The other question about adaptation, are we able to disaggregate social sectors? No, not so much. We have a other cross-sectoral category which kind of lumps in the other projects that don't fit neatly into things like water preservation or disaster risk management, resilient infrastructure. So we don't have, the numbers on, for example, adaptation financing in the health sector or education, for example, but those would certainly be interesting analyses. And yeah, we're constantly pushing at CPI to try and improve the quality of our data, and project level data. You need the gold standard for tracking, and then that would allow us to disaggregate more than we do in this report. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thanks a lot, Sean. So another question around the certain geographies, project deal size, sector that particularly suffers from the lack of funding. So Costanza, you covered that a little bit on your part, and if you can start, maybe I can complement that as well. So yeah, any geographies and sectors that particularly suffer from the lack of funding?
Yeah, for sure. Just looking at the financing gaps that we're observing, as I mentioned, there's gaps in absolute terms, sectors that really need a lot, already receiving funding like energy and transport, but we need to really still scale funding in these sectors. And then you have some sectors like portfolio and industry, as I mentioned, but also buildings, where the funding has been very low, so it hasn't picked up yet at the same scale as for energy and transport, where we still need to really increase the funding. And in terms of relative terms, you know, the size of the gap is much bigger in these sectors. In terms of regional breakdown, we do see, we know there is a big gap in, especially looking at the future potential investment needs, you know, in the future. We do see a gap, especially in the global south, as we continue to look at financing flows. We see that they're highly concentrated in the global north and in China, and a few other developing countries. So we really need finance to really step up and be scaled in other developing countries. CPI we started actually drilling into the climate finance needs specifically by region and in specific sub-regions as well. It's a work in progress, but our goal is really to answer these questions in more detail and have numbers and quantify these gaps and figure out how what are some of the options to fill these gaps in the future.
Great, thanks a lot, Costanza. And just before I go to the next two questions, one more big gap is the methane abatement finance. So we have two questions, and I would like to invite our Global Managing Director, Barbara, to answer those questions. So one is, why do we see so much finance concentrated in the global north? And then the second one is around multilateral development banks and their role in mobilizing financial instruments. Over to you, Barbara.
I'm very happy. I don't know why my video doesn't want to start anymore. Obviously, some technical glitch always needs to happen, but I'm happy to come still in and try to make this work. Let me just try one more time. Does not work. Okay, well, let me get started with the one question around why most of the investment is concentrated in the global north. I think we have done some other work across our organization, which actually shows that one of the main reasons of why we don't get investments to go into the global south is the high cost of capital that we still see in emerging economies in developing countries. And I think this is a huge issue that we have seen. The work we've done actually shows the cost of capital up to 7 times higher in emerging economies in developing countries compared to developed countries. And that is due to a number of risks that we see in these countries, from macro risks, from country risks, to specific risk related to foreign exchange or similar. And so the problem that we really are facing is that we need to address these risks and need to come up with more innovative both financial solutions, but also the right policies that can create the right certainty and the right enabling environment for money to go into these countries. So I think that's one of the big issues that we are certainly trying to work with. And I think that brings me then also to the role of the multilateral development banks, which again is something we've been working on quite a bit this year. Obviously, there has been a lot of attention to the role of multilateral development banks and the role that they have. And we've been working top down at the systems level, really to understand the reforms that are needed, not only for the multilateral development banks, but also more broadly for international financial institutions and their operating model. And I think we see 3 areas, and I'll stop with those because I see that we are at time, but I think 3 areas that we think can really help for public finance and for MDBs to better align their kind of operating models with capital mobilization. The first one is country sector platforms such as the JETBs, but also more broadly increases in domestic financing to help really enable the increases in domestic financing. The second one is based on institutional business models, so really thinking about reforms to standardize across these banks and also thinking about how can we mainstream other approaches, such as originate to distribute, but also kind of thinking about better KPIs that really highlight the mobilization and the impact metrics of these institutions, to really think about how can they use their money more effectively to mobilize other pools of capital. And then the last one is, which brings me back to the point that I mentioned on the cost of capital. And it's something we've been working on at CPI through various initiatives for several years, which is the need for greater and more effective risk-sharing instruments like guarantees, like SCADE, blended finance vehicles. And again, MDBs here have an important role to really use their capital more effectively to unlock other pools of capital and address the risks that particularly the private sector isn't able to take. So again, apologies that my video has decided to give up, but I think I'll hand it back to you, Baisa, to close us out. And thanks so much to everyone, the whole team here. It's been a huge effort, as you can imagine, and thanks to everyone for all the interest and attention to our work here. Back to you, Baisa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you so much for joining the webinar. And we'll follow up with the recording of the webinar. And we try to answer the questions live, but if not, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much and hope you have a nice rest of your days. And thanks again for joining our webinar.